Thanks, everybody. OK, so yeah, thanks for joining me here at the end of the day. I'm here to talk about reaching the next level of your career, which is to say moving from senior engineer to staff engineer. A little bit about me. My name is Joel, as you heard, and I've been a staff or principal level iOS engineer for about the past 8 years. So while I do not have all the answers, I am excited to share what I've learned in that time. So getting into it, here's what we're going to talk about today. Management roles versus IC roles. We're going to talk about what staff and beyond actually consists of, strategies to get that promotion, and then how to know whether it's worth it to do that or not. And then we'll wrap it all up. But before we do that, I need to define some terms. So when I say IC, I mean an individual contributor. That's someone who doesn't have direct reports, as opposed to a manager who does have direct reports. Senior is a terminal IC level. Sorry, I didn't have this before the quiz, but now you know. Terminal is the position from which a promotion is not expected or required. So staff and beyond are the IC levels after senior, and senior leadership is your VPs, your CTOs, and so on. So for the purpose of this talk, when I say IC, I'm going to be talking about senior, and I'll kind of use those interchangeably. And when I say staff, I mean any of the roles staff and beyond. And when I talk about your VP, which I will be doing, I mean the person in senior leadership who you will be dealing with most closely, whoever that might be, VP, CTO, director, so on. All right, so if this session is relevant to you, then this image probably is as well. Going into management is the default way to advance your career beyond a certain level. So it's worth taking a minute to discuss that option. Here is the traditional career path. Not too long ago, your choices were to stay as a senior engineer or to go into management. And no surprise that with no option to advance, a lot of people did choose to go into management. Then the industry realized that it was turning all of its most knowledgeable senior engineers into managers who had to start again at zero, and we started thinking about advancement as an IC. And this is still not super common at smaller companies, though, so it's worth to take a minute to evaluate that path of least resistance. And it's not like management isn't rewarding. You'll learn about a whole new aspect of building a team, understanding how people work together. You can satisfy your curiosity. You'll be clear on the success criteria of your new role. And you'll learn how to operate in a different area. On the other hand, if you increase your scope in your technical area, you'll still learn new things. You'll get a different view on how technical decisions impact your organization, and that view will open up new challenges. And you'll continue to hone your existing skills. All right, so before we figure out how to get to the staff level, we need to know what it is. And that's harder than it sounds because, unlike for management, there's no clear industry-wide definition. And what there is doesn't always apply directly to iOS engineers or to mobile engineers. So before getting to the staff level, job roles are pretty similar. The scope expands as seniority increases, but it's basically a reactive process of delivering on a task that somebody puts on your plate. And that's what we see in the owns row up there. Hopefully there's room to grow and influence, and a senior engineer should have a strong voice in how their team responds to challenges beyond the scope of individual project, like architectural decisions. But again, all of this will be reactive to the problems at hand. And where the other levels are reactive, staff and beyond are proactive. Your work is no longer evaluated in terms of completing tasks or features, but in driving impact to the business. This requires having a deep understanding of how the business operates and what the challenges are far beyond the technical sphere. It means trying to figure out what problems are coming in order to position the company to meet them. And to the extent that the job is reactive, it's much more about communication, helping your senior leadership understand your domain and the problems and opportunities that come from it. So it might be clear already that this is hard if you're focused on iOS. Your business impact, your product influence, and your architecture decisions are all kind of limited to the scope of iOS or of mobile, which means that you're siloed out of a big chunk of your company's surface area. And that means you need to be creative in how you position your work. Let's step back a second and talk about the shapes that a staff role can take. There's a list of staff engineer archetypes compiled by Will Larson in his book, Staff Engineer. So let's go through those. The tech lead works for their team, setting direction and foreseeing problems in a product or technical area. There's actually an image behind that, but transparency isn't showing up on this projector. That's my fault. I should have tried. So anyway, this is something an iOS engineer can only really do if there's an iOS or a mobile team, rather than engineers being distributed among feature teams. But if that is the case, it might mean your organization isn't big enough to need a staff engineer. And the architect owns the technical approach in an area that's critical to the business. This is something an iOS engineer can only do if the company considers iOS to be critical, right? Hopefully they do, but I've been surprised how often companies don't actually behave as if mobile matters. And the solver figures out problems that other people can't. This is the most heads-down coding archetype, so in that sense, it's most similar to what we're used to from senior responsibilities. But an iOS engineer can only do this if your company has enough complex, mobile-specific problems to occupy somebody full-time, which is probably not the case if you're not working someplace like Facebook or Uber. And the right hand represents an executive somewhere they don't have time, space, or background to join themselves, which effectively increases their reach. And this is hard for an iOS engineer to do because by the siloed nature of our work, you probably won't have the context to solve organization-sized problems outside of mobile. My takeaway from this is that all of the standard staff archetypes are difficult for iOS engineers because of the way we tend to work in a silo of technology, of product, and of business needs. Often things inside the silo aren't complex enough to justify a staff engineer's full-time attention, while at the same time, being in there means you don't have enough visibility outside of the silo to work on other things. So in my career, I've been a tech lead and an architect, and I'm pretty convinced those are the only two archetypes that we can really justify. You can be a tech lead on iOS or mobile teams, and organizations arranged that way, and you can be an architect for overall mobile technical strategy in an organization that invests in mobile. All right, so here's the focus, how to get that promotion. If you take one thing away from the talk, it's this: senior leadership is your focus. Your line level manager has probably never handled a promotion at this level, but your VP certainly has. Build a relationship with them before you start gunning for the job. They're the key to all of this. They're the ones who will decide when you get the promotion, and they're the ones who can prepare you for the process. So bearing that in mind, there are broadly 3 ways to go about this. If you're the first person to make this transition, you've actually got quite a bit of latitude to define what the role means. You can use the archetypes as a jumping off point, but tailor them to the kind of work you've been doing or that you would like to do. This is a great opportunity to reframe some of your successes as qualifying you for the next level, rather than having to start at 0. If you feel like your track record so far is more senior than staff, you can work with your leadership to create a plan of new work that'll get you there. This is where you need the pre-existing relationship. This path will take longer, but since the person helping you to find the path of promotion is probably also the same one who's going to give you the promotion, it's a pretty safe strategy. And if you don't feel supported enough by your leadership to put this in their hands, or if you don't want to wait, you can always leave. The sad reality is that it's almost always easier to get a promotion by joining a new company than it is by staying where you are, so this is a real option. The trade-off is that you'll be leaving behind tenure, knowledge, and relationships at your old company. Trying to adapt to a new role is hard even at the same company where you know how everything works, and it gets a lot harder when you combine it with learning a new workplace. All right, the first strategy is to define the role yourself. Let's talk about some of the work that I've been doing as a staff engineer and the lessons we can take. I spend roughly 20% of my time doing regular development work, about half of it on proactive work and the remainder on reactive work. The development work is the regular stuff you'd expect: bug fixes, features, on-call shifts, that kind of thing. Some staff engineers wouldn't do any of this, but because iOS engineering tends to be a smaller group, this probably will be a part of your day-to-day. If you remember the archetypes, this points us in the direction of tech lead, someone who's responsible for the strategic direction of a team. Here are some examples of proactive work I've been doing. I'm going to give just a brief summary of each of these and try and connect them back to some broader themes. QA. So we'd known for a while that our ad hoc QA process wasn't scaling with our product. Having worked with QA engineers in the past, I knew that they had skill sets that we as product engineers did not. So I started on a long process of convincing my leadership that we needed to bring experts on board. This meant exercising skills that I would describe as engineering adjacent, collecting data on regressions and code coverage, quantifying time spent on hotfixes, and ultimately creating a business case that I used to convince my CTO that we needed help. So you can see how different this is from standard development work, right? Part of the staff job is finding those problems that nobody else owns and taking responsibility for them. Here's something totally different. I had a piece of code that I wanted to release as an open source library. Side note, I did. It's called Quirl. It's a minimal GraphQL library. You can check it out on the Swift package index. Anyway, it turned out we at my company did not have an open source policy under which I could publish the code. So I had to go on an epic yak shaving journey. I researched other open source policies at other companies, and I worked with my CTO and with our legal team. And the twists and turns of this process took just about a full year. So building on the previous point, not only does staff work bring you outside your coding comfort zone, the feedback cycle is potentially very, very long. When you're coding, you know if your work is successful when the tests pass. And when you're writing policy, that's really not the case. Speaking of writing documents, I've also written a number of strategy documents for the iOS platform. These include a vision document, which describes the desired end state 5 years out, a technical investment plan, which lays out the process to get there, several sets of architectural guidelines, an implementation plan for adopting GraphQL, and many architecture review documents that describe the proposed implementation in detail. So we're seeing a theme in these bullets, right? A big part of the job is written communication. All this work aligns most closely with the archetype of the architect, who works on the approach and direction of projects in a critical area. And I can do this because I'm at a company that is willing to invest in iOS. Team building is a little bit different. To set the scene, after a few reorgs, we ended up with an engineering org chart that most of the iOS engineers were not happy with. So I gathered concerns from them, and I talked to our leadership to understand why the structure was put in place. Then I came up with something new that I thought would address concerns from both sides. So we see with this one that it's not just about being able to write documents, and it's not just about creating shared understanding with those documents. The ultimate goal is always going to be to build consensus. This is a really significant way that staff work differs from senior. So when you're operating proactively rather than reactively, you have no choice but to convince people that the work you want to do is the right use of your time. Now let's look at the other side of the coin, the reactive work. I think this stuff is interesting because it's still not just coding, but it is me reacting to work that has been put on my plate. The big difference between senior and staff is that a staff engineer will usually have the latitude to decide whether the work they're asked to do is a good use of their time. If you recall the chart we looked at earlier, that's how you become accountable for business impact. When somebody asks you to do something that you believe will not drive impact for the business, it's actually incumbent on you at that point to do the math. So back when we were a small company, the hiring process for iOS engineers was the same as for full-stack web engineers. When we had plans to scale up, I was asked to contribute to a new process. So I came up with a coding project based on the work iOS engineers do every day and some design topics for discussion during the interview. This wasn't something that I proactively took on, but to be honest, it probably should have been, because the need was clear, and the fact that it landed on my plate means I was probably the right person to own it. Nevertheless, in this project, we see some of the same themes. Work that's coding adjacent but not coding, and a need to do a lot of writing, socializing, and consensus building to arrive at a solution. And we can add a theme too, a poorly defined but important problem. It's difficult to make headway on a project like this without understanding the goals of the company. It's vital context to turn a vaguely stated problem like we need to fix hiring into an actionable set of steps. And this last one is pretty recent. So a few months ago, I was asked to head up a small group working on a greenfield iPhone app for a new area of the business. The work on this project was split squarely between tech lead and architect. So I was engaged in the technical work of the team's area of responsibility, and I defined the approach and direction for the new codebase. In a sense, this was not a well-defined problem because a brand new codebase encourages all sorts of flights of fancy. So my job here was to lean on my past experience and figure out where we could use work we'd already done in our main app's codebase and where we should try something new. And when you multiply that choice out over the number of decisions you have to make in a codebase, it turns out to be quite a big problem. And on the theme of slow feedback loops, we actually won't know which of those decisions were right for months or even years as the codebase grows organically around the structure that those decisions created. So altogether, this is a staff engineer's workload. If you can make the case that your time breaks down like this, and you're doing work similar to what I described, you're probably in a good place to build a definition of the role around your current job. To recap, if you're not just coding, it means you're thinking about the things that enable you and your colleagues to write better code more efficiently. And if you're writing for communication and understanding, you're sharing that thinking with an audience that consists not just of your peers, but the people above you with decision-making authority. If you're building consensus, that means you're writing as convincing those people that your thinking is correct. And if you're turning poorly defined problems into solutions, it means that you're finding ways to act upon those convincing ideas. Moving on to the second strategy, working with your VP. So if your work is more weighted to the IC side, or if your company already has a well-defined staff role that your work doesn't fall neatly into, it's time to talk to your VP and make it their problem. Your goal now is to get yourself in that previous category, where your work does match their expectations for the role and you're in a position to sell it. That means you're going to have to take on some new responsibilities and stretch yourself. And this is a good thing, because it'll give you an opportunity to try out the job before you're committed to it. Now, if I were in the audience hearing somebody say this, I'd be thinking, that's going to be a difficult conversation. I don't want to talk to my VP about this. I'll just figure it out on my own. Well, you know how in boxing movies, the protagonist tries to train themselves and they suck at it, and they reluctantly go to a coach, and it's only then that you get the training montage and the triumphant music. Well, that is you, and you need somebody to guide you through this process. So we'll get very tactical here. I'm not too proscriptive in most of this talk, but this is the tried and true process that you probably will want to follow. First, if you're at a company that has a firm idea of what they expect from a staff engineer, use that to your benefit. Read through all the supporting documentation. Take notes. In particular, pay attention to areas where the expectations don't make sense for an iOS engineer, because I promise you, it was not written with iOS in mind. For instance, at my company, one of the things on the career ladder is to define technology selection processes that impact all of engineering. Right? That's very hard to do with an iOS focus. So when you come across these things, try and think about how you could change them to be relevant to your work. For instance, I may take that thing about impacting all of engineering and change it to be about impacting all of mobile with an option to influence engineering, even if I'm not directly responsible for their processes. So once you've digested the descriptions and noted areas to change, talk to your VP about it. Let them know that you're trying for the promotion and show them that you've understood the requirements. And make sure that they understand the nature of your work and how it means you might not meet all of the requirements precisely. And then show them that you've done the work to translate that stuff into your area. And that might be the first step of proactivity on the road to staff. So when you're sure your VP understands your position and what you're looking for, put them in the driver's seat. Ask them to create a plan laying out what you need to do in order to qualify in their eyes for the next level. As an example, when I last did this, I came with a breakdown of how my current work related to the next level of the career ladder, and my VP and I together identified the gaps. They went away and thought about it for a week and came back with 6 actionable opportunities and asked me to commit to 3 of them. Because we'd already reached a shared understanding of the definition of the job, the only work they had to do was to figure out the opportunities that match the gaps. And every engineering organization is full of opportunities, which is to say problems, so that's easy. The lesson here is make it as easy as possible for your VP to do what you want. Institutional inertia means it'll be very tempting for your leadership to kick the can down the road. This isn't necessarily malicious, it's just human nature. It's easier to avoid doing the hard thing, and your VP has plenty of other stuff on their plate. So, just like with that last bullet point, you need to make it as easy as possible for your VP to do what you want them to. Discuss an actual calendar date for you to have completed these tasks and for them to have put together your promotion packet. You're going to want this to probably be a couple of months before your company's next promotion cycle, but be realistic about how much you can accomplish in a given amount of time. You may need to be thinking about 12 or 18 months out instead of 6. Giving accurate timeline estimates is an important part of every engineering role, but doing it for these big, poorly defined problems is definitely in the staff wheelhouse. So this piece of pre-work is, again, part of your audition for the job. You're going to want to get feedback early and often. Set up a series of meetings to check in with your VP and make sure that you're on the right track. They're the ones who came up with these projects, so they have the best idea of what they're looking for. And you do not want to show up in 18 months only to find out that you misunderstood the assignment. So these meetings are going to be your chance to recalibrate and make sure you're still pointed the right direction. But there is another reason to do this, too. So like I said, the relationship is the important part here, and you need face time with this person in order to make that happen. You need to remind them that you exist, that you're engaged in this process, and that you're relying on them to work through it with you. In upper management, there's just too much going on for them to be proactive about every person below them unless something is actively on fire. And I promise you, going to one of these meetings is going to be more fun for them than fighting a fire, so give them that option. So if you did everything right, you understood the ladder, you made it easy for your VP to translate your work into that ladder, you checked in and you got the work done, then you should be looking at a promotion. Congratulations. But if you're not getting the promotion, that means that somebody messed up. So first off, check back over your notes and make sure that it wasn't you. But if you're convinced that you did everything right and you're not seeing the results, then it might be time for that last strategy. As I said earlier, it is definitely going to be easier to get to the next level by being hired into it. Personally, I think that's a real problem in our industry, but I'm here talking about the world as it is, not as I would like it to be. So if you don't trust that your leadership is going to help you get this promotion, or if you tried and you don't think your efforts are getting the results that they deserve, your next move is out the door. So when you're interviewing for the next job, be careful that you're talking about the same thing. There's a certain amount of title inflation in the industry, so you're probably going to see some job listings for staff that actually have the same senior responsibilities that you're used to. Word to the wise. That said, there's not a whole lot of strategy with this strategy, so instead, let's look at some pros and cons that might help you decide whether this is actually the right move. It is indisputable you'll get the title faster by leaving than any other way. You should expect to take at least a year to earn the promotion internally, but landing a new job can happen in a matter of weeks. Now, I do not think this is 100% a good thing. Like we've just been talking about, there's lots of interesting and useful learning and growth that comes with the process of trying to earn the promotion. But if you've done that work and you're not seeing the outcomes that you want, this will certainly be more efficient. Another sad fact about our industry is that switching jobs is the best way to get a significant raise. That's true even if you aren't changing titles. Little accounting tip, companies often have separate buckets of money for salaries for new hires versus raises for existing employees. And for whatever reason, they tend to put a lot more weight on making new hires happy than on keeping existing employees happy. I don't love it, that sucks, but it is often the reality. And knowing that, you can use it to your advantage, and you can bargain ruthlessly for your hiring package. If you're going down this path because you tried the previous one and didn't get what you wanted, you're probably feeling pretty disgruntled. Starting a new place will bring some of that first day of school energy, which will give you a boost. Is that as good as taking some time off and trying to understand the root causes of your feelings? No, it definitely is not better than that. But this isn't a talk about mental health, so you're on your own with that one. On the other side of the ledger, you're going to need that honeymoon energy because you're going to be going into the deep end. Like I've been saying this whole time, staff is a significantly different job, and it comes with a learning curve. And starting in a new company has its own learning curve. Those things are going to intersect in some difficult ways. For instance, let's imagine that you're hired as a staff engineer with a mandate to improve code quality. Well, what does code quality mean at this new company? What metrics are being collected to help you track it? Are they providing data that you know how to use? What's the culture around pull requests? All this stuff is things you knew like the back of your hand at your previous company, but now you're going to be in the dark for a while. If you're hired on at the staff level, you might never have the opportunity to be promoted again. The next level just might not exist at the new company's career ladder, or if it does, you might not be considered for it. Now, this may not matter to you. You're certainly not going to get fired for not getting promoted because everything senior and beyond is a terminal level, as we have discussed and were quizzed on. But it does mean that you're not going to potentially get a significant pay raise or an equity bump or any of the other perks that come with promotion ever again. So during the interview process, make sure that you understand the career ladder, and you'll probably want to ask about how often people get promoted out of this new level you're being hired into. And leaving a job means leaving behind a lot of important stuff. There is certainly the equity of unvested stock, but I'm thinking more about the sweat equity that you build up by just having worked at a place for a certain amount of time. Like, you know the people, you know how to interact with them, you know who to go to when problems arise. And that person is probably you for a bunch of other folks at the company, which means that you've got respect and recognition. You know the code base backwards and forwards. You have informed opinions about the business model and the product direction. Losing all that is not the end of the world, but it is going to take some time to build up again. All right, so congratulations. Through whatever methodology, you got a promotion. Now you need to hold on to it. All that work that you did to earn the new role, you're still doing it. The job now is to keep in close communication with your VP to identify problems, to get buy-in, and to stay in sync on your success criteria. All of that is the work we talked about earlier when we discussed what a staff role is. But the reason for this slide isn't just to reiterate that. I want you to be thinking about this moment when you start the process, because now your success is your VP's success. And if you have a plan in mind for how you'll execute once you get the job, they're much more likely to help you figure it out. They're going to want to look good when you succeed. So one more time, make it easy for them to give you what you want. Put yourself in a position where they get what they want too. All right, taking a step back. So far, we've been discussing this change in like a strategic, value-neutral way on the assumption that you want the job and we need to figure out how to get it. But I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about some downsides that you should at least consider before you invest all this time and energy. First off, you're not going to be coding as much. In fact, your coding time is going to be so constrained that the responsible thing to do is to take yourself off the critical path. You should not be working on the most deadline-sensitive stuff. This means two things. One, if you really love coding, you're just not going to have as much fun day to day. And two, you'll be learning more slowly, and your skills might even backslide. So if you derive a lot of value from your ability to code, you're going to need to find another way to get that, maybe a personal side project. And compared to a full-time coding job, where you know you're doing it right if the tests pass and the app doesn't crash, the feedback loop is going to be slow and uncertain. So imagine you're in charge of a process to change the interview process. You won't know if it was successful until you have the new interviews in place, you've hired some people with that process, and you've seen how they do at their jobs. And that's a year minimum. So if you thrive on rapid feedback, you're going to have to find a new way to get that satisfaction. In a proactive job, you don't necessarily know what the next thing you're working on is. That's true for every staff role, but particularly for iOS, where because of the size of the silo, you're going to have to work a little bit harder to find and identify those opportunities. If a lot of your work is coming from projects landing on your plate, that means that you're not extending yourself enough. It's an uncomfortable place to be. Along with those unclear responsibilities come unclear success criteria. If you're defining your own work, you're also in charge of figuring out when you succeeded, but not really, though, because there's still a VP above you who's going to tell you if you got it wrong. So you need to be sure to keep communicating and keep in sync with your leadership about what you're doing and your expected outcomes. And as we just spent a lot of time discussing, the process of getting here is not easy. It's time-consuming, and especially if your company doesn't do this promotion often, there are bound to be some missteps. Unlike the other downsides here, this isn't an ongoing cost unless you want to get promoted again, in which case the whole thing is just going to start right over. So if you looked at that last slide and decided that it's not worth it, that's okay. There's no expectation that you do this. If you're even in a position to be considering this, though, it means that you're probably quite valuable to your company. It would be expensive for them to replace you, so it is in their best interest to keep you happy. So let's think about it. Are there other things they could do that would make you happy? One path people often follow is oscillating back and forth between management and IC every couple of years. This is a great compromise because you get to try out new areas and responsibilities, but you come back to coding often enough to keep your skills sharp. Like we talked about at the start of the talk, management has a lot of new skills to learn, but unlike staff, there's a very clear path to get there. You could also look for another area of responsibility that'll allow you to flex and grow your IC muscles. For instance, is there a new greenfield project coming up that you'd like to drive? Or maybe there's an opportunity to work on CI or infrastructure or a design system, some enablement that'll help everyone you work with. Or maybe you'd like to work more closely with your design team and do prototype engineering. There are a lot of opportunities to add value while staying close to the code. And if the company has to choose between losing all of your output or some of it, they might be willing to modify your hours. You could try to use your capital to change to a 4 or 3 day a week schedule, or even 1 week on, 1 week off. I know that may sound far-fetched, but I know several engineers who've done exactly that. All right, to recap. Staff is not necessary to have a successful career. But if you want it, start by building a relationship with senior management. Nobody really knows what the job means, so you can define it yourself, or you can work with your VP to define what it means in terms of your company. Make it easy for them to give you what you want. Work to the definition to earn that promotion. If your company can't give it to you, then you can either get it elsewhere, or you can find another way to be happy with your job. Hope this has been informative. Thanks so much for sticking around. Questions go to Slido. Thank you. Thanks so much.